Welcome to Gift of Life, the Organ Transplant Podcast. These are the stories of those who have received, given, and who are waiting for the gift of life, organ transplantation. Now here's your host and heart and kidney recipient, BJ Odom.
Welcome to Gift of Life, the Organ Transplant Podcast, a place where we journey through the incredible world of organ transplantation. I'm your host, BJ Odom. Each week, we uncover inspiring stories and meet extraordinary individuals who are connected to the world of transplants. Remember to support us by leaving a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcast. Don't forget, we're also on Facebook at Gift of Life, the Organ Transplant Podcast. In this episode, we are honored to have Adrian Marshall, a licensed clinical social worker with 12 years of experience in healthcare. Adrian has been instrumental at HCA, Florida Largo Hospital Transplant Center, a facility that has been leading the way in organ transplantation since 2015, offering kidney transplants, expanding to liver transplants in 2017, and LVAD treatments for heart failure patients since 2018. Noteworthy is their groundbreaking first heart transplant in 2019. Get ready as we delve into Adrian Marshall's profound insight and rich experience in the field of organ transplants. I first heard from Adrian because she told me, Tampa General Hospital isn't the only place in Tampa Bay that performs transplants. So I said, let's get on the podcast. So what were some of your main duties there at Florida Largo Hospital Transplant Center?
Yeah, so I was a part of an interdisciplinary team. So what's very typical at transplant centers, nationwide, is that there's a team of not just physicians, but a pharmacist, a dietitian, a social worker. And the purpose is we all kind of have our own piece of the puzzle as far as assessing for if a patient in need of a transplant is a good candidate. And basically our job is to do everything we can to assess for and kind of plan for their hopeful success with their transplant.
Now, I remember when I first got my transplant back in 2003, and I don't know if this is you or not, but you have to go through a whole rigmarole of, not only tests to see how you are, but I remember my wife even had to talk to a counselor to make sure that whoever you're giving that organ to is going to be able to take care of it. And of course, they're not going to throw it out the window or something. So that's kind of
exactly.
So what are the steps you go through?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is transplant is different from a lot of other surgeries in that a lot of people don't know, just because it's all new for them. A lot of people don't realize that the reason it's different is we are dealing with a scarce resource. There are not enough organs available to everyone who needs them. And so that is why all of those tests and assessments are so necessary because, if somebody either passed away and opted to be an organ donor prior to their death, or if you're lucky enough to get a kidney from a living donor or even liver, a portion of a liver from a living donor, that's a huge offering. And that's such a gift. So what the team does is not only educate the patient, but also assess to make sure that they have all the tools necessary to be successful after transplant. So the other piece of that is it gives us an opportunity to, if there's something identified prior to that suggests that, wow, this might be a barrier or this may influence somebody's success. If it's something, a lot of times it can be something that can be corrected. So for example, if a patient comes in and their identified caregiver, maybe they work full time and they cannot, they're not in a position to where they can take time off. Well, my job as the social worker is to sit down with that patient and really brainstorm and try to figure out how can we really piece together an optimal care plan? How can we figure out a way so that after the transplant, the patient's needs are ready and available and, to really promote their success. A lot of people, it's very common that people think about this as just another surgery when in reality, not only is it a major surgery, but also there's so many pieces that continue after surgery. It's not just going in, getting the surgery, recovering, and that's it. There's a lot of maintenance that has to be done. And there's a lot of things that can be influenced by, somebody's a change in their life situation or a change in various aspects of their life that can really impact their success. So that is what we are trying to do, is identify ahead of time and hopefully improve or come up with new ideas to ensure their success.
Now, they always talk about the caregiver. So now the caregiver is like very, very important. And how do you work with people like, let's say a single person comes in and they don't have a caregiver? Can you help them towards finding a caregiver, or how would that work? Or would they be X'd out of the program?
So yeah, I definitely, especially at Largo, we were very careful to really take the time. We didn't want to exclude somebody just off the bat because a lot of times the patient doesn't realize that, you don't have to have, it doesn't have to be a spouse, right? You don't have to walk into our program with your spouse, in your arm, ready to go. So a lot of times what I do is I'll sit down with them and say, hey, tell me about what do you do day to day? What are you involved with? Do you have a good relationship with coworkers? Do you have a neighbor? Do you go to church? Do you have church friends? To me, as the social worker, I really didn't care. It didn't make a difference to me. It did not have to be a relative. It just had to be someone who was willing to put in the time and the ability to be there for that patient, and also driving, because our patients after transplant, typically at least a month, depending on how they were recovering, they were not allowed to drive. So to answer your question, what I do is I really ask all of those questions about who is in your life. Sometimes patients will ask me, well, I don't have any friends, I don't have any family. There's people out there that just choose to kind of live a solitary life, which is fine. So they'll ask, can I pay somebody? Can I just have my health insurance provide somebody? So the tricky thing with that was, in our program, our caregivers have to be involved from day one. So what that means is they come to the initial appointment, they complete the transplant education with that patient, because we want them to get the same education as the person who's going to be ultimately getting that transplant. So when we talk about health insurance, so, a lot of health insurances will provide home health care after a hospital stay or something like that. The tricky thing is they will not come into the picture until that patient is post-surgery, ready to go home. Health insurance will not pay for someone to just kind of attend all the pre-transplant appointments. So, a lot of times people do come to us and say, I'm ready, I have home health, I'm good. And unfortunately, I have to tell them that does not meet what our requirements are as far as caregivers. Now, if we're talking about paying someone, that is something that, we would potentially consider as long as that person can commit to being involved from day one. And the other tricky piece that I did come across a lot is the waiting time, right? So these patients, if they get approved for transplant, they end up waiting anywhere in the state of Florida. The average wait time for a kidney is about 3 to 5 years. So a lot of people would say, well, what's the point of me, appointing somebody now? I don't know what's going to happen in 3 years. And that's certainly a fair concern. So all I can do is really make sure we have viable caregivers day one. And then I just tell the patient, if something changes, let's say it was your spouse and God forbid something happened, they passed away or they became ill, it's their responsibility to notify us, hey, I've had a change in caregiver. And to which at that point I say, great, bring them on in. Let me meet with them. Let me make sure that they understand what's involved. And basically what we look for is this person has to be physically well. They have to be able to drive. They need to be able to participate not just in pre-transplant education, but also the education that's done at bedside before the patient goes home after their transplant. All of these things are so important because, again, it goes back to the fact that there are not enough organs. So if someone is lucky enough and blessed enough to be able to get these organs, whether it is a kidney, whether it is a heart, whether it is a liver, we need to make sure everything is in place to really hope for the best outcome so they can be healthy and get back to their life and just, have a long life with that organ.
Okay, let's say that someone needs like a kidney or a liver, or you have a living donor. Now, do you interview that person also? Is that in your realm? Do you work with those folks also?
Yeah. So in my program, I was there, like I said, about 6 years. So there were certainly a lot of changes that happened over the years. The program, ever since it opened, has grown a ton. So we've definitely had to shift, like, who is kind of responsible for what. Ideally, what we like to do is we like to have, for donors, they actually get evaluated by a social worker like myself. But there's also another employee, a staff member, that's called an independent living donor advocate. So the living donor actually gets kind of two people. One is kind of doing that social work assessment. The other is there to be an advocate for them. That role is so important. The person that has made such an amazing decision to come forward and donate their kidney to somebody, we have to protect them. We have to make sure that they are not only competent enough to make this decision and understand every bit and piece that goes into it, but also we have to make sure that they understand that they actually have the right to change their mind literally up until the morning of surgery. This is a huge decision for someone to be a donor. And a lot of times it's someone makes this decision because they care so deeply for this person, or they were inspired by something, whether it be something they saw in the news or whatever the case may be. So we have to make sure that even though, yes, they truly want this, we have to make sure they understand every single piece of it, all the possible outcomes. Because when it comes down to it, donating a kidney is still a surgery. So we have to make sure they understand risks, understand potential outcomes, understand that what they can do, post donation, now that they only have one kidney, how to really optimize their lifestyle and their health and making sure that they don't have any kind of complications that could have been prevented. So yes, we interview, obviously the donor. And the other thing is that a living donor is also required, at least in our program, to have a caregiver themselves. Their recovery is shorter typically than a recipient, but we have to make sure, because those folks are unable to drive for a period of time. But that's also because, again, they did such an amazing thing, such an amazing gesture. We want to make sure that they have people there to help them so their recovery goes as smoothly as possible.
Now, do you also work with like donor families as far as deceased donors, or did you ever have that opportunity? And how does that work? Because I know that's kind of a teeter-totter situation sometimes too.
Yeah. So the thing to be aware of, and these are all pieces that for any patient who's new to transplant, these are the things that they learn. Somebody coming to us for the first time, there's so much information and there's so many moving parts when it comes to organ transplant. So more often than not, if our surgeons are offered an organ, whether that's a heart, kidney, liver, we don't have any contact with that deceased donor's family. And the reason for that, other than just privacy, conflict of interest, that sort of thing, the other reason for that is a lot of times it's coming from miles and miles away. So, for example, there is something called an Organ Procurement Organization, or OPO. Different transplant centers are under different OPOs, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But one of the reasons is it identifies the area in which organs are offered to that center. So ideally, when we're talking about an organ coming from a deceased donor, it is so important that that organ is preserved, protected, transported safely to the recipient. So there's a certain mileage. So a lot of times, for example, at Largo, we would get organs from Georgia, from Alabama. I think we even would get them from Puerto Rico on occasion. So primarily because of the distance and privacy, we have no, communication with that donor's family. Yeah. I mean, really when the surgeon accepts that organ, we do get a profile of the donor, the deceased donor, so that we can see, how this person passed. We know their medical history. And a lot of times the recipient wants to know. So that's another piece of the puzzle that people often ask is, what can I know about my deceased donor? I want to know, how did they die? Who were they? And the biggest question is, am I getting a quality organ? Am I getting a good one? And so what I tell my patients is, be aware that our surgeons are never going to accept a poor quality organ for you. They're only going to accept the best available for you as far as quality, as far as there's a lot of measurements and kind of ways to kind of quantify how quality of an organ that is. We do get a profile of that person without their name, but we really can't share any of that with the recipient. The only time that a surgeon is going to, provide any kind of information about that is if that kidney is considered, or if that organ is considered a high risk organ. So what we are required to do is we are required to tell a recipient if a donor, based upon medical history, age, based on some social factors, if that organ is considered high risk. When you go in to be evaluated for your transplant, you have an option to consent to receiving a high risk organ or not. And we can tell you what that means, like what are the factors. So for example, did that donor have a history of substance abuse? Did that donor spend any time in jail? Did that donor have particular health issues? Was that donor a little bit older? So these are all things that will then kind of identify that organ as high risk. So those are the pieces that the surgeon is able to tell you, for example, if it's high risk or not. But aside from that, we really cannot provide much information. Now, post-transplant, and this is, as the social worker, I always made sure my patients knew this. Every single patient that gets an organ from a deceased donor has the option to write a letter to the family after transplant. What I tell my patients is, you can write whatever you would like, whatever feels right, whatever's comfortable, and then they bring it into me at the clinic and I forward it to the donor's OPO. So for example, if that kidney came through from Georgia, that would be a different OPO. So I send it to that OPO, and that OPO actually knows the contact information for that donor's family. We do not, but that OPO does. So we send off letters, and I just tell my patients, listen, you may get a response, you may not. So you just have to understand, these people lost a loved one. So, they may either still be grieving or just not feel comfortable. But, I'm always hopeful, because that family is allowed to return that letter and tell that recipient anything they want. So if they wanted to share that their son was, a lawyer and he was really interested in baseball or whatever the case may be. So that brings some comfort to my recipients, that there at least is a chance that they could get to know who this person was. And I think a lot of people do like to look for that sense of connection. And those are the people that really understand just the magnitude of what this is, and understanding how much of a huge gift that it is for them.
I just a couple of weeks ago had a donor family mother on the podcast with me, and she had an opportunity to listen to her son's heart. And that was an incredible story. And it gave her, I don't know if it gave her closure, but I could tell by her talking, it gave her actual comfort to hear that heart beating.
Absolutely. And so that's exactly what I tell my recipients, my patients, is that a lot of my patients might worry, what if I say something wrong? What if I don't want to, say something that might be inappropriate. And what I tell them is, there's really nothing that you can say that would be inappropriate. And in addition to that, we don't know this family, right? So we can't even predict. We don't know who they are. We don't know their lifestyle. We don't know their religion, their culture. So really just keep it simple, express your gratitude. Tell them how how blessed you feel to have gotten this gift from their loved one. And, then I usually say, you can just tell them how well you're doing. Tell them how getting a transplant has been able to let you go back to work or let you feel well enough to spend time with your grandkids or travel. Those are the things that pretty much in any scenario, I think any normal human being who, made such an amazing gesture by either, because sometimes people, organ donors, it's not always somebody who opted to be an organ donor prior to their death. A lot of times it's the family, the next of kin who made that decision after the fact. So you got to remember that in a lot of scenarios, these are family members that made this decision. So for them to hear, yes, in fact, my loved one's organs went to this person and now this person is doing well, that's wonderful. So you really can't go wrong when it comes to these letters and, worrying about saying something wrong. There really isn't, a way of messing that up, I guess.
I will tell you this from, receiving 2 organs, both deceased donors. Those letters were very difficult for me because, and I'm glad that, hearing this, and I hope others that maybe down the road would have a transplant would hear this too, because I was almost not ashamed, but afraid to write the letter and going, oh, I feel great. This is wonderful. I'm going back to work. I'm doing what I love to do. But I hated to do that because in the back of my mind, I was going, oh, I'm telling these people how great my life is. And they lost a loved one. And that was probably of the whole way through, to me, that was the most difficult of all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as long as you acknowledge, as long as somewhere in your letter you say, I recognize that this was a really tough part of your life. And if you're just acknowledging that, I think in most scenarios, you are accomplishing that piece that you're worried about, absolutely. And I've had patients who, I remember one patient of mine, he was so funny. I would go and see him, at his follow-up appointments, and he would say, I'm still writing my letter. I wrote the first draft and he's like, I just want to sit with it and just make sure. I want to read over it. I want to put it down and come back to it a week later and make sure that I'm really, making everything sound correct and getting my points across. And I just said, that's fine. I said, whatever you have to do to get it to where it feels right for you. And the other great thing is there's no time frame. So there's really no deadline. You could write a letter to a family 3 years after your transplant. So I really just tried to help my patients feel comfortable, give them advice only when they wanted it, because it doesn't matter if it takes somebody 10 drafts to write a letter that feels right to them, fine. I've had such a myriad of versions of letters. I've had some patients write 2 sentences. And I said, fine, you don't have to do anything else, And then I've had other, family member or other patients rather that write front and back typed, single space, So really, there's really no right or wrong way to do it. And what I find is that once that letter is sent, there is a sense of relief from my patients because they know that, whether or not they get a response, they know that letter, that message was sent to the family, and they know that they had an opportunity to just say thank you. And that in and of itself, I think I have seen is really great.
Well, one thing I'd really like to talk about for a second too, because you're on the inside, you've seen both sides of the situation. Yes. Try to explain to people that are thinking about donating organs that what you see on TV is fantasy. It's not that there's a doctor sitting there going, oh, I have a person who needs this kidney and they need it now. And if this person over here dies, boom, I can maybe pick up that. That doesn't happen. It's 2 different people, 2 different programs, 2 different everything. Yeah.
So I admittedly am a lover of medical dramas. And honestly, part of the amusement and entertainment factor for me is the fact that there are so many, inconsistent and, just incorrect ways of doing things. I mean, when I tell you, I have seen shows where a cardiothoracic surgeon is doing a liver transplant, and I'm sitting here like, wait a second, that is not how it goes. But anyway, no, absolutely. Do not, definitely if you are someone like me that enjoys those shows, by all means. But when it comes down to a point where this is actually a real thing happening in your life, please, please do not take what you see on those medical dramas and take it for fact, because they have to entertain people. So, I mean, in my mind, transplant, the way it really happens, has enough of a great storyline, but obviously we're not producing a show on NBC. So, so absolutely. No, I would say if someone is, either knows somebody who is needing a transplant, or you yourself had just been told about it, go online, go on the internet. And I know a lot of times, we always joke in healthcare about Dr. Google and that kind of thing, but go online and there are so many great resources as far as people telling their stories, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. The other thing that people can do is find out if your area has groups, support groups, not just online, but perhaps in person. At Largo, we, at one point prior to COVID, we were doing a support group, and we included pretty much everybody, pre-transplant, post-transplant, caregivers, because everybody has a piece of the puzzle that they can share their experience, and everybody's experience is different. Take two people that both got kidney transplants. Their experience, their recovery, their surgery, every piece of it can be so markedly different that it's so important to look at those, what's online as far as people's stories. So, for example, a great story on our website. So if you go to hcafloridahealthcare.com and look under the services offered at our hospital and go to transplant, I believe there's a video there about some brothers that we transplanted, and both of them were lucky enough to get kidneys from living donors. So, it's out there. All of those stories are out there. So, and it does happen where, in my experience, I would have people come in and, kind of ask me, so I saw on Grey's Anatomy, or I saw on, ER, this and this happened. And, we have to come back and say, no, that's not exactly how it works. And they get it. Most of the time they understand that it's a show, but, definitely it's very rare that it happens where you have someone coming in emergently needing a transplant, and then somebody up on, the sixth floor has a liver that this person's going to pass away. And part of the reason of that, and part of the reason that a lot of people don't realize that these transplants don't just happen within the hospital, is because of these waiting lists, right? So, we could literally have someone in liver failure in our ICU, and then we could have another person on a different floor passing away from some other unrelated condition. If that person who is, at the end of their life and is an organ donor, there's a good chance that those organs are going to go somewhere else, because there's other people who have been waiting on the list much longer and, need those organs. So yeah, the likelihood of a donation, because of a death, going to a recipient who's an emergent need in the same facility is very, very slim.
I'm glad you cleared that up, because really a lot of people, when they think about organ donation, that's their biggest fear. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to, go to the hospital and they're going to, want to take my organs, so they're not going to take care of you. That's, like I said, it's usually two different hospitals. No one is sitting there just, yes, there are people waiting for organs, but no doctors are waiting going, oh my gosh, would this be a candidate for my patient? Because that's
right.
Not the way it works.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Now, when we talked off air and, we were on the phone, one of the first things you told me was something from me being a heart transplant patient that I had never heard of before. And I'm looking on my notes now, trying to find it like an idiot. Oh, here it is, the LVAD, the LVAD, or how do you do it?
Yeah, the LVAD. Yeah, so There is a mechanical device called an LVAD. An LVAD is an acronym that stands for Left Ventricular Assist Device. And what this is a device that was created for patients who are in heart failure. And there are two different scenarios where an LVAD comes into play. So first, if you have a patient who is being treated by a cardiovascular, cardiothoracic team, and they decide, you know what, you're in heart failure and there's really no other procedures or options or interventions that can be done that either are appropriate or that we haven't tried already, this device can be an option. Now, there are two kind of scenarios, like I said. The LVAD comes into play. One scenario can be what's called bridge therapy. What that means is it's oftentimes used for patients in heart failure who are waiting for a heart transplant. So let's say we have a patient who is, in really critical condition, they're in the hospital, but perhaps an LVAD would actually be able to stabilize them enough to where they can leave the hospital and they can live their life relatively normally until they get a heart transplant offer. So that would be an example of a bridge therapy option. So it helps people to sustain life until they get that heart transplant offer. The other way an LVAD comes into play is what's called destination therapy. And what that means is a patient who is in heart failure, but perhaps they have some other condition or some other problem going on that makes it to where they're actually not a candidate for a heart transplant. People have to remember that there's so many different things, even medically, that have to fall into place so that this is a safe option for them. So if a cardiothoracic surgeon or your transplant team decides that for whatever reason, you are just not an individual who will do well with a heart transplant, or there's something that makes it way too high risk, this is an option, the LVAD, that can be a way to treat heart failure when transplant's not an option. So that again would be destination therapy. So the LVAD itself, let me preface this by my primary role was on the abdominal side, the kidney side. So I do have some knowledge about LVAD, but it was definitely not my focus. So I'm going to do my best in explaining. So what it is it's a device that, again, you're in heart failure and it's a mechanical circulation device that helps the blood and your heart keep pumping, or it kind of does it for you. So you end up with this device in your, chest cavity, and it's attached to a battery pack that is external. So when somebody has an LVAD, they are going to have to carry a battery pack with them so that the device can keep working, throughout your day, nonstop, because it's doing for you what your heart is supposed to do. So what happens is patients that get their LVAD have to be very specifically educated on this device, how to take care of it, how to take care of everything internally, externally, how to understand that you are basically dependent on battery source, understand that what you do at home, they have to be assessed to make sure their home has adequate electricity. You have to have a safe place where you can charge. You have to have a charging station for your batteries. You also have to have a plan, especially in Florida with hurricanes, you have to have a plan for if you lose power. So it's really fascinating because when we're assessing patients for an LVAD, we have to make sure that at home everything is in place so that they can, have batteries charged, ready to go. And I will say it does sound very cumbersome. And obviously I don't have one myself, but I imagine that that can be really kind of frightening for some people, that they have to literally walk around with a small bag over their shoulder or a fanny pack, or there's a lot of different options, but they have to have this with them at all time, and they have to be mindful of how long that battery lasts and prepare for it. But I will say we saw a lot of patients who did really well with it. It just kind of becomes second nature. It kind of just becomes one with you. So yeah, it's really interesting. And that's another thing where people can go online and do a search and learn about it. We had, I believe our first LVAD patient at Largo, he did end up getting a heart transplant, but I believe his story is out there somewhere online because he was the first LVAD that we did, I believe, in 2018. So it's really fascinating. So yeah, like I said, it's either an option, a precursor to heart transplant, or an option for those who, are not a candidate for a transplant.
You may be the perfect person to ask this question, because I remember, I was looking for a kidney back, in 2015, and I know they've made, they've done wonderful things since then, but I keep hearing the rumor of someday having, an electronic kidney, or, they'll have an implant. How far along are they, and how far are we away?
So I really wish that I knew the answer to that. So yes, we would have people that come into our office, and they would either ask, hey, do you guys have those mechanical kidneys? Or they would also say, hey, do you have pig kidneys? Because both of those things have been in the news in the last 10, 15 years. So, I don't know a lot of detail, but what I will tell you is I first heard about the mechanical kidney in 2013, 2014, before I even knew that I would end up working in transplants. So what I typically tell people is just keep in mind that when we're talking about new advances in medicine, especially with mechanical devices, it's going to take a long time. And the reason for that is obviously there's so much testing that has to be done. And, just because when in the instance of a mechanical kidney, even if they can sit there and say, okay, each piece of this device is working as it should, it's accomplishing what it needs to, that's only one very small piece of the puzzle. Then they have to see if it works in a living person. But again, a lot of times these things are tested in animals, regardless of your opinion on that, that's just honestly the way that it is. So they have to take these mechanical devices and put them, they have to test them. So they have to see if they work in some type of living being. And then you got to remember, what if it doesn't? Then it's back to square one. So there's just so much that has to happen before they can even consider trying it in a human and then going through that trial process and making it available to humans. We saw in the news that I believe last year sometime maybe, there was a gentleman, I want to say in Texas, I could be wrong, but he, I believe, got a kidney from a pig, I believe. And the thing with that was he had to obviously consent. He had to understand that they weren't 100% certain about the success rate of it because it was so new. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the reason that he was approached by this or he agreed to it is I believe he had a couple previous kidney transplants before from humans, and for whatever reason was no longer a candidate to get a kidney or be listed on a kidney transplant waiting list. So he, I believe, got a kidney from a pig. And it did work. And again, I have to do my own research, so please do not quote me on this, but I believe it worked for a little while. And then ultimately something happened and he did pass away. So, but even though that had a sad outcome, that gave the team and the scientists and the physicians that were working on that, it gave them so much knowledge. So I'm hopeful by seeing those things that we will eventually get to a point, again, whether it's a kidney from an animal or a kidney that was, mechanical, obviously that would be great. It would be very interesting because, if we had mechanical kidneys that were an endless supply available, they were FDA approved, they're probably, I don't know that there would be dialysis anymore, right? I mean, it's amazing to think about all these things and how it could change. So while I don't know a whole lot about when or timeframes, I'm still hopeful that something like that will happen, hopefully in our lifetime, because, I would love to see organ transplant kind of approached similarly as a joint replacement. And that's an analogy that I use a lot with people that are having a hard time understanding why we are so particular and we have so many hoops and things that have to be done for a patient to be considered. I kind of tell them, okay, think about a knee replacement. So we know that these are ball and socket joints that are produced at a mass rate and they come off of conveyor belts. And that really helps to explain to people and help them realize why the requirements are what they are for organ transplant. You got these devices for joint replacements, an endless supply that are being manufactured, continuously. So that kind of helps people understand why transplant is different from, like, for example, joint replacement. But I would love to see one day that perhaps we can have mechanical organs, and it can be that way where we have them coming off of conveyor belts. But, until that happens, this is what we have to work with. And all I can do is really, encourage people to be organ donors. Please, 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 when you go to the DMV, please opt to be an organ donor. I know there's so many statistics out there about how many lives that a single person can save. And it's not just organs, it's eye and tissue donation. There's so many things that can save people's lives from a single person. So, if someone wants to be a living donor for a kidney or a portion of their liver, that's even greater. But please be an organ donor. After your time on this earth is done, please consider all the people who you could save and help after your time on this earth is over.
My favorite bumper sticker: you can't take your organs to heaven.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, I was an organ donor even before I started in transplant, because I was kind of the thinking of, well, I don't need them anymore, So yes, that's all I can say is, please consider. I would love to one day live in a world where we didn't have over 100,000 people sitting on waiting lists for organ transplant. It would be great if every 10 years that number was, cut down by even 20% or something. That would be incredible. So.
Well, Adrian, I thank you so much for your time. Anything before we let you go that you positively want to tell people that we didn't get in this? Because I could talk. I could talk to you for hours. You're very interesting, very informed, and I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us here.
No. I think what I just want to say is, if you live in the greater Tampa Bay area, please be aware that you have more than one option. You hear about Tampa General because I think they just celebrated their 50th anniversary of their organ transplant, and they are a massive, amazing program that does so many transplants. But please be aware that they are not your only option. Right in Pinellas County, HCA Florida Largo Hospital, we do kidney transplant, heart transplant, liver transplant, LVAD. We have a great team there. The surgeons are great. The medical directors are great. So definitely don't be afraid to take a trip over the bridge to Pinellas County. And the other thing to consider is not every program has the same requirements. So if you do go to Tampa General, or if you go to Shands, or if you go to Advent in Orlando, and if you are declined, please don't take that as the end all be all. Explore your options, go to different centers. You got to remember that each center has their own requirements and they're entirely different medical teams. So, if Advent Health says no, go to another center and see. So, if you are in a position to explore all these different centers and ultimately get listed on different centers, that will only help your case. But yeah, HCA Florida Largo Hospital in Largo, Florida, west side of Pinellas County. I really think it's a great program. They do a lot of great things. And, I just encourage people to really explore and be aware that you have more than one option in this area.
A heartfelt thank you to Adrian Marshall for sharing your wisdom and your story with us today. Join us next week for another touching episode of Gift of Life, the Organ Transplant Podcast. If you have a transplant story you'd like to share, reach out to us. Our email is bjodom55@gmail.com, and connect to us on Facebook at Gift of Life, the Organ Transplant Podcast. Until next time, I'm BJ Odom, reminding you all to appreciate each day and cherish the extraordinary gift of life. Thank you for being part of our journey.